Welcome to the Wildscast. I am so proud to present this conversation I just had with two very smart Jews. Okay, Aaron Zimmer and Elie Fader. They have their own podcast called From Physics to God. They're brilliant. One has a PhD in algebra, in mathematics. The other one has a degree in physics, and they're both very learned and knowledgeable Jews, actually both ordained rabbis. And we got into the concept, into the discussion of science and religion, specifically God. How can we know that there's a God from studying physics? And why is it that some scientists who are great physicists do not believe in God? And how do we reconcile our belief in God, if you have one, or if you're struggling with your belief in God? What are some proofs? Or maybe we shouldn't use the word proof. What is some compelling arguments for the belief in God? That's one of the things that we discussed as well. We got into the whole issue of multiverse because some scientists believe that the universe, that there's many universes out there, and they're using that to explain the world without a God. But is there any evidence for the multiverse? We got into that important question, and then discussed some other issues that have to do with the Torah itself, with the Bible. All right, do we have to read everything literally in the Torah, especially if it conflicts with science? What do you do when you come across a verse in the Torah, a pasuk in Chumash that seems to conflict with proven modern day science? What do we do with that in Judaism? And are we really in control of our decisions in life? Or are we just sort of playing out some kind of script that someone else has written? The belief, the fundamental Jewish belief in free will. Why is it that some scientists don't believe in this? Many do. Many philosophers debate and discuss this. What does the Torah have to say? Take a peek, take a listen, and of course, subscribe. Welcome to the Wildscast. I am on with Aaron Zimmer and Elie Fader, both of whom are well-versed in both physics and Torah. Tell us a little, for those who are not familiar with your own podcast, with your own background, where did you guys study both Judaism and science? And tell us a little about the work that you guys are doing.
Okay, so I'm Elie Fader. I studied Torah at Yeshiva B'nai Torah. I received smicha, yora, and yadin there from my Rabbi Chait. And while I was doing yeshiva, I studied in Queens College undergraduate. I went to CUNY Graduate Center, in which I received a PhD in a field of math called algebra, specifically braid group cryptography.
Wow.
And now I do research in a field called graph theory. I'm interested not only in mathematics, I'm also interested in physics and science and psychology and philosophy. I have a wider variety of interests.
Beautiful. Thank you. By the way, Elie and I also studied at Rabbi Chait's Yeshiva a long time ago. I was there for 2 years, had a great experience. But I didn't get smicha from them. I went to YU and I didn't get yadin at all. So that's really impressive. And I certainly don't have a PhD. Aaron, tell us, what's your background?
Okay, so that makes three of us here who when I learned at Yeshiva B'nai Torah. I got smicha from Rabbi Chait. And I went to Queens College for undergraduate. I got a degree in physics there. And after that, I was deciding whether to go to graduate school or not. I chose to go into commodities future trading. We're trading cotton and sugar and natural gas and oil, crude oil. And I did that for 11 years using the ideas I learned from physics, the categories from physics, and the brisker derech that was taught in Yeshiva B'nai Torah, using those conceptual categories to analyze markets and to think categorically. And I was able to, retire after 11 years of trading commodities futures. And now I learned Torah with Elie amongst, other people, other chavrusas.
You're still learning at Rabbi Chait's?
I was in a shir for 17 years. I gave shir there, Gemara shir for 2 years. And I just have, chavrusas and basically, still there. I never leave the yeshiva. Why would you leave, if you don't have to? So, I trade. I had to work, but I traded commodities and I learned Torah, and now making this podcast, Physics to God, to try to, kind of synthesize, put together ideas of God and physics, to, try to unify the two different streams in my life.
Wow. Well, kol hakavod that you're able to be so devoted to learning at this stage of life and continuing to study science at the same time. So you guys are quite qualified in both areas, I have to say. We got some doctorates, a lot of smichas, a lot of rabbinic ordinations here. So let's dive right into it. First of all, do you think religious Jews should be doing, or any Jew really should be doing what you're doing, which is not only to study Torah, but to study science? Why is that so important?
Well, the way we see it is that that Hashem is the author of the Torah, and He also created the universe. And a person could see the wisdom of HaKadosh Baruch Hu through both areas. As the Rambam describes, the mitzvah of Avas Hashem stems from a person seeing the wisdom of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the universe. Yeah, so our primary preoccupation is with learning Torah, but at the same time we like to study science, to read science, to see the wisdom of God manifest in all of His work.
I would just add one thing, is that, as for the question of religious Jews, is I find that unfortunately, like, a lot of religious Jews relate to, especially modern Orthodox, relate to science as, and they encourage learning science, but it's really for like the means of having a profession and being successful and making money, and it's not really like, there's idea of Torah lishma, but people don't think of science lishma. And
Well, what does that mean?
Like Elie was.
Just explain.
Oh, lishma. Okay. Meaning for its own sake. There's an intrinsic value in studying the natural world that God created, and understanding it and seeing the wisdom of God in the world. And it's not just a means of getting a job and making money, but there's just value in knowing the natural world and seeing how it leads to God, and it makes you appreciate that the creator of the universe. And I think that there's, in a certain sense, it's science is not really emphasized for its own sake as much as Torah is for its own sake, but there's also value in understanding the world God created for its own sake.
Sure, that's a great point. So let's get into some of the issues, because you're both extremely. And by the way, I also want to thank our good friend Rabbi Penny Rosenthal, who I met many, many years ago at Yeshiva B'nai Torah and has been on the MG staff for a long time. I think he's our shadchan. He's how we met each other. So do you fundamentally argue, and how can you fundamentally argue that modern physics conclusively points to a creator? Conclusively, or is it just, I'm writing something now, a basic Judaism book, and what I'm arguing is that of the two options, which is that there is a creator behind the universe, or there isn't a creator and things spontaneously sort of exploded into existence, or through evolution developed on their own. I argue that, like, the God rationale makes more sense than the alternative that science gives. But do you believe that there is a conclusive, necessarily we get to this conclusion kind of thing?
So if you say like a conclusive and the word proof and things like that, people sometimes think you mean like these absolute proof, like in mathematics, where it has to be, it's impossible any other way. What we say is a convincing and compelling argument, which I think sounds a little bit stronger than the way you're framing it in your book. And I understand there's like a certain amount of skepticism people might have that you really could have a really convincing, compelling argument that God exists from physics. But we really do show that in the podcast. We've worked on this it's really been 12 years. We've been writing a book for 10 years. It started off as a blog. This whole the whole argument, discussed it with many people, and the only reason we're really making it public, it's because it's just so much better than, like, in our opinion again, but so much better than all the other stuff that's out there. A lot of the other arguments that are out there are good arguments. Maybe God makes more sense than the others, or it's intuitive. You say this is more likely than that. But like this argument, when you get down to physics, and there's certain unique things about physics that make it special for really showing in a convincing way that God exists. It's really much better than the other stuff that's out there, in our opinion. And for that reason, like we really don't like when it gets like lumped into like a lot of the other ones, because a lot of the other arguments, because then you don't really realize how unique it is and how different it is, how much more convincing it is. So it's not an absolute proof, but it's convincing. Person who hears the argument understands it, as we try to do through our podcast. We think we'll be convinced and walk away that the proper inference from physics is that God exists.
And can you share some of the physics or some of the science that leads you to believe that, a compelling argument for God from modern day physics?
Okay, so on a basic level, it's there's various components to it, but just I guess you could say on standing on one foot argument is that modern science has discovered various features of our universe, special features of our universe, one of which is what they call the constants of nature. These are specific numbers which are built into the very fabric of our universe. Numbers, for example, like the mass of an electron, which is, or the strength, something called the fine structure constant, which is the strength of an electric charge. And there's various numbers built into our universe. And these numbers, it's been shown by modern physics that had these numbers been different, have been outside of a small range of values, our universe as we know it simply wouldn't exist. We would never be able to have atoms, we wouldn't be able to have molecules, we wouldn't be able to have stars, planets, life. And these are features, these numbers are they're called fine-tuned. They're specifically tuned in a way which is necessary. Without these numbers being in this small range, all we would have is a chaotic sea of fundamental particles. And that's one type of a thing, is these constants are indication. We illustrate how the precision of these numbers, the fact that they're in precisely the range necessary to bring about our universe, points to the fact that these numbers are connected with a purpose.
Explain to us laymen, what do you mean by these numbers? Like the numbers that go into, explain, just elaborate a little more if you don't mind.
Well, maybe, like, for example, you have in physics, you have qualities like two charges, like an electric charge, they attract each other if they're different, a proton, electron. An atom, they'll attract each other. But then how much do they attract each other? How strong is that? That's a number, that's a quantity. So part of the very laws of physics is not just the fact that, let's say, two masses are attracted because of gravity. How strong is the strength of gravity? How strong is the strength of electromagnetism? Or how heavy is an electron? If you were to measure it, you were to weigh it, it could be very heavy, it could be very light. It happens to be it's very, very, very light. But whenever you deal with the physical world, you're not just dealing with qualities, you're dealing with quantities. And these are specific numbers that are set. They're called fundamental constants, meaning they don't really have any explanation, a deeper explanation from the framework of physics. They're just like there's gravity is a fundamental law of nature. Part of the fundamental parts of nature that can't be reduced is a constant that's part of gravity, the strength of these types of things. And that's what these numbers represent, the quantities of nature. And they're always the same everywhere. Every electron is always the same mass, is always the same, is always as heavy. The strength of gravity or electromagnetism is always the same. And these are set by these numbers called constants.
And how does these numbers, to you, they lead to the belief in a God of creation? Because why? What's the next step then that I'm missing?
It's been discovered by scientists, and this is accepted by scientists, atheists, theists alike, that these numbers, it was previously thought that these numbers are just numbers, they could be anything. The way we know what these numbers are is we measure them. And whenever we measure the mass of an electron, it's always exactly the same. Some ridiculously small number, 0.0000327, whatever, some long number. And these numbers, it was previously believed that the numbers could have just been anything, and whatever they were, so be it. But it was discovered more recently about many of these numbers, and most convincingly in 1998 about something called the cosmological constant, which is that these numbers, had these numbers been any random value, then our universe as we know it would have never existed. And all we would have had is a totally empty, chaotic universe with nothing complex in it, not even atoms. And the fact that these numbers, which scientists have no explanation for, Richard Feynman called explaining these numbers the greatest mystery in physics, or one of the greatest mysteries in physics. This problem of how do you explain these numbers, it was discovered that these numbers, the values of these numbers are precisely what they need to be, or within a small range of what they need to be in order to result in our universe, in the unfolding of our universe as the universe unfolds. And that's a shocking discovery, the fact that these numbers are so precise. And it's a discovery which, again, scientists, everybody agrees with this discovery that these constants are fine-tuned. The only question is, which we answer one way and some scientists answer a different way, how do you interpret the fact that we have these what seems to be this amazing coincidence, that these values which happen to be the numbers which are precisely necessary.
And you can't explain the existence of those numbers through modern evolutionary theory. In other words, the idea that everything is so precise. I mean, this is the argument, the teleological argument, that the complexity of the universe, the fact that we are, this far away from the sun, so that we still get the warmth of the sun, but we're not too close to the sun, so we don't burn up. So that precision, I've always felt, implies a divine creator, something beyond human that creates this specificity and complexity. But that cannot be accounted for by any other scientific theory. Evolution cannot account for the precision of those numbers. I understand that they sound random, but doesn't science explain randomness through evolution?
So that's a great question. There's 2 points to answering that, but basically, Elie spoke a little bit to extreme there. Scientists do have a theory for how to explain it. It's called the multiverse, which is very similar to what you're saying, right, Wild, is that it's a theory that there is an infinite number of unobservable other universes, and all these universes have different values for these constants. So in one universe, an electron weighs what it does here, and in another universe it's 100 times heavier. Another universe is 160 times lighter. So every single possible value of the constant exists in a different universe. And then you were to say it's kind of like the thing with you're saying with the planet, is that if you were to say, well, what are the odds that these numbers came out exactly right for our universe, even though it really is in this incredibly small value, if it's just by chance alone, it's so unlikely to happen by chance alone. But say, look, there's an infinite number of universes. In one universe, there's going to be a universe which has the proper constants. And we live in that universe because only that universe is it possible to have an intelligent life, asking the question of why are these constants correct? Just like you were saying, there's hundreds of billions of planets in the galaxy. And now, what are the odds that the Earth is in exactly this Goldilocks zone, exactly this distance from the sun? Well, the scientists will tell you that's not really a good question, because all the other planets that are not the right distance from the sun, they don't have any intelligent life on it to ask the question. So it's not really a big wonder that we live on a planet the perfect distance from the sun, because there's hundreds of billions of planets. Some of them are in the right distance, and life can only evolve on this planet. But the key difference is that physics is fundamental. Biology is not. The distance between the Earth and the sun is not a fundamental fundamental principle in nature. There's many planets that have different values, but these constants are part of the very laws and fundamental principles of nature. There's no evidence that there's other universes with other laws of nature. It's totally speculated. These are unobservable universes. While astronomers do astronomers do see other planets, and that makes a big difference in whether there is validity to just speculating that. They're not just speculating there's other planets, but multiverse scientists are really positing these unobservable parallel universes. That's a big difference between the two arguments.
So that makes sense. I appreciate that clarification. So you're saying at the end of the day that you can explain, let's say, the complexity of the universe, or these numbers, Elie, like Elie was just explaining, that you can explain the complexity. Only way really you can explain them is if you believe in a God, a creator, a supernatural creator. But you're saying, Aaron, well, then if you believe in multiple, many universes, and this is the one that kind of got it right for people, then you can. All right. So why do scientists believe in multiverse if there's no positive proof or evidence in, we haven't observed any other universes. We've observed other planets within our universe. So why do so many scientists today believe, or am I wrong? Is that not true that so many scientists believe in the universe?
Yeah, that is true. That is true. Yeah. So start off with the point about God is that I think many scientists, as many people who are not religious, I guess, are skeptical of God. They think that God, they know their religious friend or religious fanatics or people who just throw around the word God without any justification for it. And I think they feel like often the sentiment among scientists is that you're not solving anything by saying God. You'll ask a question. Well, who created God? Who designed God? What does God even mean? And they have a lot of strong questions about the idea of God. So while it might seem that the evidence is pointing to an intelligent cause, they'll say that's obviously not a reasonable possibility. After all, we're scientists, and we know that doesn't make any sense. They've never heard any reasonable theory about God. It's just there's a lot of ideas thrown out there, but they feel like science and mysticism, they look at God as mysticism, and therefore there can't possibly be a legitimate theory. And we have to look elsewhere. If there's God, we see these numbers are fine tuned. The natural way to explain that would be God. That's obviously not a possibility. Let's see what else there is. We don't see any other universes. Well, that's an argument they use in favor of there being a multiverse, because how else in the world could you possibly have these values being, fine-tuned if there's only one universe? However, that's part of what we're going to do in our podcast series. Is we're going to have a separate mini series on God, and we feel that the argument that the fine-tuning indicates God is not really a compelling argument if you can't answer those questions, if you can't formulate an idea of God which stands up to the critiques which atheists raise against God. Then we're not really solving anything. We're just pushing the problem back. Okay, so who created God? And you haven't really explained anything. So we show how the argument leads to a cogent theory about God and how to think about God. And it actually is in line with the Torah's idea of God, with the idea of Yichud Hashem, the oneness of God, and the way those ideas about God are formulated by our giants, let's say, like the Rambam and Maimonides and the Chovos Levavos, Bachim, and Pekuda. That the idea of the oneness of God is the foundation of the Torah, and the appropriate way to think about God actually solves the problems which scientists raise.
But Elie, to distill what you're suggesting, you are suggesting, which by the way, I'm not saying I disagree with, but I just want to make sure so it's clear to me and to our listeners that the reason why the scientific world, or maybe it's not the whole scientific world, but the part of the scientific world that accepts the multiverse theory are accepting it because there's no other rational explanation to the precision and complexity of our world other than to say that there must be other universes out there. They just cannot accept that there would be a God because they have such negative associations with God or religious people that they're going to have to go with a theory that they can't prove because the alternative is God. I mean, are you going as far as?
That's part of what I'm saying. That's not 100% true. That's part. What I'm suggesting is the reason why God is not a possibility is because they don't have a sophisticated idea of God, and God to them is a big mystery and doesn't explain everything. That's why they're not willing to recognize God. But that's not the only reason why they believe in a multiverse. We're not suggesting that. There are other indications or reasons why they believe in a multiverse, but this is why God is not an option.
Yeah, so I
And
mean,
maybe Aaron, you want to talk about the other?
There's certain theories like they have called eternal inflation, which leads them to believe that an extrapolation of interpreting our one universe, if you don't want to have inflation fine-tuned, it's that inflation is the idea that the universe expanded really quickly after the Big Bang, then it would lead to, let's say, an infinite number of universes. And again, it's not observed and it's not proven, but it's an extrapolation from a current theory they have. Or they have string theory, which has so many different possible versions of it, which could be considered a flaw in string theory. They say, well, maybe if there's an infinite number of universes, every different version of string theory is a little complicated physics exists. We're going to go all through this. Not only are we going to do a mini series on God, we're going to do a mini series on the multiverse, because this is the mainstream belief of scientists. So there are what they call supports for multiverse, and there's reasons that they're motivated to believe something like that. But I really think that most scientists. Some scientists hate the multiverse because they think it's not scientific. It's you have to change the definition of science in order to accept multiverse as science, because the scientific method has always been, prediction and observation being compared to reality. So you really have to change what is accepted as science if you want to say multiverse is science. And there are numbers of a number of scientists who just hate that idea of changing what we mean by science that's worked for 300 years in order to accommodate the multiverse. But even beyond the scientists who hate it, I think even multiverse scientists, they know it's a very wild and speculative theory. Parallel universes. Who ever heard before 20 years ago that scientists actually believe in parallel unobservable universe? The whole thing sounds crazy. And so I think even scientists themselves don't really want to say it. And the real motivation for why why they believe in the multiverse is much closer to what Elie's saying, is because they just think the idea of God. They say God is impossible. We have quotes from Lee Smolin saying just God is an impossible theory. Doesn't make any sense. They really think it's a dumb theory. It's not coherent. It's not logical. It's just totally faith. And we're going to show that that's not true. It's a coherent, logical theory, which is the intuitive interpretation of an idea that emerges from this whole fine-tuning argument is God. And I think if they understood the idea of God's oneness in the way we're going to present it, it's a very rational, clear way, I think they'd be much more willing to accept that interpretation as opposed to multiverse. I don't think they love the multiverse, but it becomes the only option if you think God is impossible.
Interesting. And let's go a little to, this is very helpful, guys. Thank you. Let's go a little to not the complexity, sort of evidence or basis for believing in God, but the way the world came into existence to begin with. Right? The famous Stephen Hawking, in his famous book, The Grand Design, he said, and I'm quoting, he said, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue torch paper and set the universe going. So tell us, what's your feeling on this? Why is Stephen Hawking wrong, in your opinion? Because he's saying the world can, on its own, come into existence. Now, we weren't arguing that it couldn't. We were saying, until now in our conversation, that because of the complexity of the universe, the best explanation is God. The most compelling argument is God, okay? But what about this would be more the cosmological approach, that the cosmos came into existence. Can something exist from nothing? What we call creation ex nihilo. We believe that God's the only one who can create something from nothing, but we human beings can only take something. So how did the world get into existence? Hawking is claiming here that the world something can come from nothing. Is that true?
So the reason that this is really the reason why we don't use the Big Bang or the fact that the universe seems to have a beginning as the argument, because it does run into this. Scientists will say that it came from nothing. Now, just to clarify, when Hawking is saying that it came from nothing, it didn't come from absolutely nothing. It came from the laws of physics, quantum mechanics and general relativity, or he's saying gravity there. It's the laws of physics are a fundamental existence in Hawking's theory. They have no cause. They're eternal existences. And through those laws, they generate a universe from nothing. So we don't want to argue with scientists. In our podcast, we never argue science with scientists. We do not. We at all. We're not arguing. We're not professional physicists. We're not going to argue science with scientists. We're only accepting the scientific consensus on fine tuning, and that the universe, let's say, had a Big Bang. But we're not going to Like, is Big Bang really the beginning? Multiverse scientists disagree. They say that there's an eternal universe that cycles back and forth. So we don't try to prove the idea of God from the fact of creation or the fact that the universe has a beginning, because it runs into other scientific arguments. The arguments we use are accepted by scientists. The question is, what's the interpretation? Is the interpretation a multiverse, or is interpretation God?
But I'm just to simplify this. We do believe as Jews, the Torah subscribes to the idea that at some point there was a moment where the world was not. There was a lot of time when the world was not, and then it came into existence. Okay, we believe that God caused that to happen, right? But Hawking seems.
I believe that too. I believe that too.
Yes.
But not all scientists agree to that, and that's a much that it seems pretty compelling because of the Big Bang that that's the case. But there's room to argue. There's room for.
It seems compelling that there was a moment of creation.
Yes.
Right, and
yes.
and the world of science believes that too. They believe in the Big Bang theory. The only disagreement, explain.
No. There's disagreement. For example, multiverse scientists believe that you could have an eternal cycle of universes, or an infinite numbers of universes. Each one has its own Big Bang, but all matter might be eternal. So it's not really. There's no real. The simple interpretation of the Big Bang is that the universe has a beginning, and I would agree with that it does, and certainly as Torah Jews we believe that, but it's not as compelling and convincing to argue that has to be the case. The arguments that we use are better than that. That's why we don't use that. We don't use the argument from the beginning in the Big Bang, because it lends itself to. There's a room for scientists to argue that. The arguments that we use, there really isn't an argument for them to. For them to say anything other than, let's say, a multiverse and randomness, things like that.
What's your argument then? Can you distill it in like a minute? In other words,
Well, the idea, this argument we just said, that basically what Hawking is saying is that the universe comes from nothing, but what he really means is the universe comes from the laws of nature, which he's talking about. He says gravity or quantum mechanics, and the idea is these laws themselves have constants that are built into them. The laws take on a specific form, and those laws are fine-tuned. And science has discovered that those constants are not just any old constants, but they have to be specific values in order for, even with the Big Bang and with all the assuming that Hawking is right, the universe would come from nothing, but it would never result in the formation of atoms, of molecules, of stars, of planets, of life, of anything, if the constants in those laws, which Hawking believe are eternal, weren't fine-tuned to be precisely those values, which would result in the future emergence of our universe all those years later. So it's, yes, the universe, even granted that the laws themselves could generate a universe, which, again, we don't believe that they do. We believe God did it, but even granted those laws, but the form which those laws take, the constants which they have, are fine-tuned, and that points to intelligence. The fact that the numbers are precisely those numbers necessary for the future emergence of our complex universe indicates that the values of the constants are explained by a teleological cause, by God who set them with a purpose of bringing about our universe.
So how do they respond to that, to what you just said? That, you just argued essentially that all of these laws, including gravity, they're very fine-tuned, and they had to pre-exist. They had to exist in order for the world to come into being, in order for the world then to continue to develop the way it did. So what does Hawking say? Like, what's his response to that? What would be, the classic scientific response to, well, where do those laws come from? Where do those finely tuned laws that were necessary for the world to get to where it is today, and then come into existence? Where did that come from? How does it? I'm repeating myself. Sorry.
Right. I understand. Yeah. So the answer is that they suggest that although these are the laws and these are the fine-tuned constants in our universe, and every observation we've ever done indicates these constants are constant, they're fixed, they always are these same fine-tuned values. In truth, there's an infinite multiverse of many, infinitely many universes, and which we can't see or observe or verify, and each one of these universes, the constants are different values. Again, we've never observed anything like that, the constants changing, but they suggest that in different universes, every one of the universes, these hypothesized universes, there's a different set of values for these constants. And therefore, the fact that our values are fine-tuned is just the result of we happen to be in the fortunate one. We're an observation bias that we happen to be in the one universe out of the infinitely many, which happen to have the right values of the constants. So that's the yeah.
That explains how things develop on their own, maybe, the complexity and all that. But in terms of the initial coming into being, where do those rules and laws come from if there was nothing before?
So for the laws themselves, Hawking believes, or believed before he died recently, that that the laws are eternal. They just are that way. Just like if you were to ask somebody, where did God come from? So he's going to say, look, that God is the first principle. He exists. He's a fundamental existence. There is nothing that causes God. He causes everything else. A scientist will say that the laws of nature are they are the fundamental existences. They're these complex equations that govern all physical reality. They might generate universes on their own, according to Hawking and other physicists. And they have no cause. They just are that way because they are that way. And you can't ask that question, which is legitimate in a certain sense. It's legitimate to say that everybody's, no matter who you are, whether you believe in God, whether you are a physicist, there is going to come a point where you can say, I can't explain any further. I can't say what caused God, and they can't say what causes the laws of nature. They're just going to say those are their gods in a certain sense. Their gods are complex equations.
So Aaron, they're really attributing, certain power to the laws, to nature itself, the way we attribute that power.
Absolutely, they believe in these powerful equations, gods. They're uncaused, but they're complex. Meaning they have a lot of parts. There's different parts to these equations. They're not simple. They're not like one God in that sense. And they're unintelligent. That's like the big argument. They hold that these laws are unintelligent. They don't know what they're doing, but they're infinitely powerful. So there's these infinite powerful, stupid laws, or unintelligent laws, let's say it in a nicer way. There's these infinitely powerful, unintelligent laws that just create infinite numbers of universes. The laws don't know what they're doing, but since they make an infinite number of universes with garbage everywhere, that 99.9% of these universes don't have anything interesting in them because the laws don't know what they're doing. But then by chance alone, you end up with a couple of universes that have the right constants and the right laws of nature, and you get this amazing, wonderful universe that we live in. So they do have gods in a certain sense. They're just not intelligent.
That's so interesting. Right. And they can explain. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Right. As opposed to we start with the point is that we observe there to be one universe. That's all that any indication, any science tells us, that we see one universe, and anything we see about this one universe is that these constants are fixed, constant values. They call them constants of nature. And assuming that, going with that, the fact that the values of these constants are fixed, fine-tuned in a manner which is necessary for the future emergence of our unbelievable complex universe, that points to the fact that this one universe was fine-tuned by an
even if you did
creator.
subscribe to multiverse, let's say we just, for the sake of argument, we start to believe in multiple universes, even though they're not observable. You still have to explain how these laws came into existence in any universe. Where did they come from? So you're saying the scientists believe it's just they're embedded within the physical universe. They were always there. Is that kind of like what Aristotle, the great debate between Maimonides and Aristotle? I think he believed in the eternity of the universe, and the Rambam couldn't accept that. Maimonides couldn't accept because we believe in a point of creation. Aristotle never believed in a point of creation. So do these scientists subscribe to that? They really believe it's sort of in the eternity of the universe. It always existed.
So the quote that you read by Hawking is not he's not saying the eternity of the universe. Hawking is saying the eternity of the laws. The laws are these absolute realities and they generate a universe. But there are a lot of scientists who still believe in an eternal universe, meaning matter itself is eternal, energy is eternal, and that it goes through different phases, and out of the eternal energy, different universes spawn out. So there's still an argument among scientists whether matter is eternal or matter has a beginning, like it seems at the Big Bang. But all of them say that the laws of nature are eternal. The laws of physics have no prior cause, because I shouldn't say all of them. There are some scientists who believe in God, but they all say the laws of physics are these abstract universal principles that exist. And then there's a question whether energy itself is created by these laws or energy is eternal and has always existed.
Okay, that's really helpful. Now, you guys quote various physicists, scientists in your podcast. You mentioned Richard Feynman, also Steven Weinberg, who of course was Jewish. He famously said that the more we study the universe, the more it seems pointless. Now, given the fact that he and other scientists agree with him, and you guys have the same physics he's looking at, we're all operating with the same facts here, but we're coming out with different conclusions. What makes you guys different? Is it the fact that you were just raised to believe in God, or you spent a lot of years in yeshiva, or is it something that, do you believe what you're believing, even if you didn't spend all those years in yeshiva or been raised to believe in God? I'm curious. Because yeah, go ahead.
Right. Well, we could. Yeah, well, there are various answers to that question, but one of them I think is actually related to the subject of our podcast, and I think this is part of what's motivating us to make this podcast and to try to bring these ideas to a broader audience. Is that scientists like Weinberg and like Hawking, they make statements like this. God is outdated. We don't need God anymore. The world is pointless. And people who respect scientists, they say, "Oh, see that? The scientists say that this is outdated. And if you want, you could just believe in what our rabbis told us, or we could accept these great scientists who everyone respects." And we're trying to show that it actually comes down to this point. Scientists themselves, you don't, because of fine tuning, you have to believe in something. You could believe in an infinite multiverse, which is pointless, where there's a chaotic sea of infinite universes, all of which are totally chaos, different constants, and we happen to be in the one lucky coincidental universe, and then everything really is pointless. Or you could see the indication of modern science that there is fine-tuning, that our universe was designed for a purpose by a God or a creator. And the argument of modern physics is pointing in the direction of a purpose, of a creator who created it for a purpose. And then we believe the Torah, Hashem revealed to us, God revealed to us that purpose through the Torah. He's showing us a way to live, and we're part of that purpose. So that's, in a certain sense, the basis of our religion is God. And we're showing modern science points to the idea of God, and it leaves room for the fact that, hey, if God did create the universe, did he have as man part of the purpose? Or is that part of his goal? And we believe God revealed to us, yes, he gave us the Torah, and he showed us that we are part of the purpose. So it kind of hinges on this point, is where do you see, this very question is, how do you interpret fine-tuning? If you interpret it as infinite chaos, then yeah, I guess it's pointless. It's just a random coincidence that we happen to exist on this one universe. If, on the other hand, you see how it points to a creator, which is what we are arguing, then why is it purposeless? On the contrary, the universe is created by God for a purpose of bringing about our amazing universe. And let's see what our place in that universe is.
For most people who are not as philosophically oriented, like all of this God, no God, and the physics, is it supported or not? Like, what does it have to do with me in my life? And you just said it, which is, because if there is a creator, then there has to be a point to creation. And if everything just came into being spontaneously, randomness, we could try to come up with our own meaning in life, and hopefully we'll stumble on that, but it makes such a difference if one believes that we're here for a purpose, for a reason. What is that reason? And that's where, of course, the Torah comes in. So let's dive into that for a little between now and the end of our conversation. I really appreciate this, guys. I asked this question to some other physicists who also believe in Torah and Judaism. I spoke with Dr. Gerald Schroeder, famous MIT physicist who wrote Genesis and the Big Bang and a couple of other books. I spoke to the Dr. Chaim Presby, very, very impressive physicist and rabbi, and Natan Slifkin, who you know is he's the animal doctor, but quite a scientist in his own right. And I asked him about Genesis 1, Genesis 2, the beginning of creation. Are these factual scientific descriptions of the universe? How do you guys approach the Torah's opening chapters that describe the creation of the world and of man, people?
So I think it's like very important to distinguish between ideas that are fundamental principles of the Torah, that God exists, that there's divine providence, there's such a thing as miracles, things like that. That without them, the Torah doesn't work. If there's no such thing as a miracle, the Torah just doesn't work. There's no divine providence, the Torah doesn't work. Versus an issue where how do you interpret the literal? How do you interpret the verses? Are they literal? Are they figurative, metaphorical? Are they speaking in a scientific framework? Are they speaking in a historical framework? Are they speaking in a values framework? So those are completely different issues. How do you interpret verses versus contrasted with does something contradict the underlying principle of the Torah? So what we do, our approach is based on Maimonides, and there's other of the earlier sages that, in terms of the first two chapters of Genesis, is we no longer have a tradition exactly what each thing means, and we have different interpretations by our sages that when they work, that's great, and when they seem to contradict modern science, then you say that it must be that we interpret them in a metaphorical way, in an allegorical way, something that's different. And you're not going to throw out the Torah because a verse has to be interpreted figuratively as opposed to literally. So those questions, they don't bother us, and they haven't bothered the great sages of Jewish sages. And in truth, it's much more, I think Christians are tied to that philosophy that everything has to be exactly literal. I know there are a lot of Jews who do hold that, but I don't think that's our tradition, that every verse has to be taken exactly literally. What would bother us is if something in modern science contradicted a principle in the Torah. Something modern science showed that it's impossible to have divine providence, that it was impossible to have free will. Miracles are impossible. God doesn't exist. Something like that. That would undermine the Torah. That would cause you to say, look, if modern science showed God didn't exist, you're not going to have the Torah or you'd have a contradiction in your mind. You'd be stuck. So those are real problems that we spend time trying to deal with. But the questions of how to interpret the verses, that to us is a secondary issue. You'd like to take it literally if you could. If it contradicts what your mind tells you is true, then you have to interpret it metaphorically.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, thank you, Aaron. So, for example, the world was created in 6 days. God rested on the seventh. And that seems to be negated by modern evolutionary theory. What's your take on that specifically?
Right. So there's various psukim in Tanakh, various verses in the scriptures, which basically use the word yom to not necessarily mean a day, a 24-hour period of time, but to be referring to a period, like the period of the Messiah, of Yemos HaMashiach. Or maybe if some other verse refers to the yom to refer to the unit of the 6 days of creation. So the verse, and there's various, there's a Ramban who mentions this. Nachmanides says the word yom sometimes doesn't refer to a literal day. So whereas perhaps it was until science knew that the universe was 14 billion years or whatever, it was reasonable to believe that a yom literally means a day, a 24-hour period. But if science indicates that that's not the case, and it indicates that the universe was actually much, much longer, so then we have a long tradition of interpreting words of the Torah in various ways, and the word day itself refers to a period of time in various instances. So 6 days doesn't necessarily have to mean 6 24-hour periods, but it could be 6 periods of time. And the verses are indicating that God didn't create the universe in one fell swoop, that it was just there, but there was an unfolding of the universe in various stages, and there were 6
And,
stages of the universe
I
until
heard,
it came to its final culmination, which is Shabbos. So there's it's an interesting statement of the Rashba, Shlomo ben Aderas, who basically from the 1200s, he says something to the effect, I don't have the quote exactly, but that it's the way of the pious people of our tradition that when they come across a verse which is proven, which the plain interpretation of it is contradicted by proven knowledge, by proven science, then we interpret it metaphorically. So there's a long chain of a history of interpreting verses. As we know, it says the hand of God in the Torah, but God doesn't have a hand; He's not physical. So there's a long history of interpreting verses metaphorically when we know that can't be the case. Of course, I would think the assumption is the verses are that they're literal, but if science shows that that's not the case, then we have to reinterpret.
Also, I had heard, that's very helpful and also clear. I didn't realize that was the Rashba, the way of pious people to interpret a verse metaphorically when it goes up against proven science. Is that the reason also why the sun is not created in the Torah in Genesis, doesn't come into existence until the fourth day, I think, right? And the way we define a day isn't it? You tell me, I'm not a scientist. I thought the way we define a day is the rotation of the world on its axis. And isn't that somehow related to the sun? If there's no sun, then can you even consider, you don't even have to go. In other words, Elie, you're saying because the term yom is used to denote not simply a 24-hour day, but can we say, based on the fact that the sun doesn't come into existence according to the Torah till day 4, that you can't have a 24-hour day until the sun comes into existence? No?
You could argue that. I mean, I think the Ramban at the time, again, based on his science, thought that they were 24-hour periods. It's not going to be based upon the sun, but you could take the amount of time which it takes for the sun for the day, or our day, and say somehow project that backwards. So it's true that the day isn't going to mean literally like what we interpret to be a day. Like can't be Vayer Vevoker, it was day, it was evening, and it was day. Can't refer to sunrise and sunset, given that the sun wasn't in place. But there would be ways to interpret it as being 24-hour periods, even though the sun isn't in place. And I think there's a Ramban who suggests that it was literal. But again, there's no reason why the Ramban would suggest otherwise. We're not saying that there's a tradition that it's not literal. We're just saying that given that modern science indicates that the universe was not that way, then that indicates we have to interpret it as a metaphor. Because Ramban also, there's an analogous Ramban. He says, this is also Nachmanides, who says that the plain interpretation of the verse of the Torah would lead us to believe that the rainbow was created right after the flood. He says, but he says it's not true. We know that the Greeks tell us that a rainbow stems from the natural properties of water and light, and therefore we have to reinterpret the verse of the Torah that when the Torah says, "I placed my rainbow in the cloud," it doesn't mean he placed it there at that moment, but it means the rainbow which he created previously was now being utilized to be a sign about of the covenant between God and Noah. So Ramban also is saying look, based upon the science, we have to reinterpret the passage.
Most Jews in America, let's say, have not had the benefit of yeshiva education. Have not really studied the Torah, the Bible, Hebrew Scripture critically. And most Jews, I think, understanding of Torah comes from a little more of a Christian concept because that's the civilization we live in. It's the culture. And many Christians read the Bible literally, as you said before. So this whole conversation I'm having with you guys right now is worth it just for this very point. For anyone who's listening to this, it doesn't mean that we don't have a methodology. We just interpret verses in the Torah willy-nilly. But there is no such idea in Torah that we have to read every verse literally. Okay, when I sometimes say an eye for an eye, ayin tachat ayin, and we obviously don't read that literally. So most people think, that's because we're moderns. But if you would really be a biblical Jew, a Jew who takes the Torah seriously, you would pluck out, God forbid, somebody's eye if their eye was taken out. And that's not the reason we don't read that verse literally. We don't read that verse literally because we have the oral tradition that teaches us how to read a verse. Where's the comma? Where's the period? There are no punctuation points in the Torah. So the whole thing is left up to our Masorah, which is our classic understanding of how to read the biblical text. So that's a very, very important idea. Gerald Schroeder, anyone listening to this also should pick up his book on this, because he makes that point in the very beginning of the book, that's not the way classically Jews read the Torah. Literally, if you did, you'd have a lot of problems with science. One last question. You touched on this before. I think, Aaron, I don't know if you said this or Elie, that if there were things, Jewish values, Jewish beliefs like providence, miracles, that science would contradict. Okay. And you did mention free will. Now, I believe in free will. And I believe what Maimonides wrote about free will, that we have the power to choose, even if we have inclinations towards a certain way. And even if I'm a little more of a chill guy, as opposed to my friend that's more of a hothead, he still can control it. I believe in all that. But how do you guys make the case for human freedom, given the fact that so many philosophers and scientists, and I wouldn't say the majority, I don't know, I don't know the numbers, but I know that there are scientists and philosophers who believe in free will and scientists and philosophers who don't. How do you make the case then for free will? Or do you just say, listen, it's a Torah value, it's something Judaism believes in, but is there any kind of scientific reason to believe in it, or a scientific reason, or the reason that, say, some scientists give that we can't believe in free will, that you contradict that?
So I would say, in this, there's first you have to think about it scientifically and then philosophically. So on a scientific framework, I don't think there's anything in science that contradicts the idea of free will, because I guess for two reasons. Usually it comes from the idea, the thought that science contradicts free will comes from either the idea that people think that the laws of nature are deterministic, which is what scientists used to believe before quantum mechanics. They used to believe that deterministic means that if you know one point in time what a system is in, then necessarily you can predict exactly where it'll be in the next point in time. But in fact, we know the laws of nature are not like that. They're probabilistic. There is no necessary relationship between cause and effect where A will always cause B. It's much more complicated than that in quantum mechanics. So that's like, past 100 years or so, we see the universe is not deterministic in that sense, certainly not absolute determinism. And also it comes from the question, again, scientifically, before you get to philosophically, from the theory that like your mind is you're just a big computer. Your mind is just, you're basically an AI. Your brain is just some sort of very complex artificial intelligence thing, which is not, it is a presumption a lot of materialistic scientists have. But it certainly hasn't been proven true. Roger Penrose has really amazing arguments, but subtle, against it. I think it's book Shadows of the Mind, The Emperor's New Mind, which he showed that your mind must be something more than just an algorithm, or the way AIs work now. So really, from the framework of science, and this is a much larger discussion we're having now, from the framework of science, there's no real contradiction. It really you really have to think about it philosophically. And the question philosophically, these are age-old arguments, whether such a thing as free will or not. In my mind, the way I look at it is, yes, of course, the Torah, it's a fundamental principle of Torah, and we have a tradition on that. If you can't really prove it scientifically, philosophically, then you should absolutely accept our tradition. That's the way, that's the proper methodology. But in a philosophical framework, I think that once you deny free will, and you say that you are just compelled to believe everything because you have no choice, in a certain sense, you lose the whole idea of truth becomes meaningless. Because what you believe to be true, even if it was false, you'd have to believe it's true because you're determined to believe it's true. And in a sense, it ends up undermining the human mind itself. And your ability to know that, to know that there's no such thing as free will is predicated on using your mind. And if your mind is no longer good at determining the truth because you're determined to believe whatever you believe, it ends up in a certain sense becoming circular. And it's a skeptical attack on the human mind itself. So I think when you think about it, free will is part of what we mean by something being true, that you choose to believe it's true as opposed to false. And to reject free will ends up undermining the value of truth and the very argument against free will itself.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that you can get just very sort of nihilistic and nothing means anything if you think everything is predetermined, everything is pre-programmed. Is there any kind of scientific basis? Like we started our conversation about talking about the existence of God, and you both made a very, I think, compelling argument from numbers, from the specificity, the fine-tuning, the complexity of the universe, that there has to be a creator. Is there anything like that indicating free will? Or it's really just something that, as you articulated, there's nothing in science that tells us we don't have free will. The Torah believes because I can always make an argument like it's better for us to believe in free will, because otherwise nothing means anything and life is pointless. Then you're just a robot, like you're an actor in some sort of play that's been pre-written before you even came into this world. So that's not really a philosophical argument. That's more of a practical thing. Like you want to have more meaning in life, you better believe in God and free will. That's what I've been telling people. But, is there anything scientific? I doubt there is. I'm just curious because I got two scientists on the phone here.
You know what? Unfortunately, I think that I don't think there is. I mean, that's why, like on our podcast, the truth is, we don't want to give off the wrong impression. Our podcast is not really about religion. It's not about free will and things like that. It's really about God, because there's really an incredible, compelling, convincing argument from science that God exists. Once you get to things about free will and providence, there are arguments, but they're not as convincing and as compelling as the idea that God exists. So our podcast is not really about religion and these topics. It's amazing that you could really show convincingly that God exists from science. After you know that God exists, it becomes easier to discuss providence and free will and things of that nature. But I don't know. I mean, Elie, I don't know if you have something up your sleeve here, but I don't think you have something
Listen,
to the level that you.
What I'm loving about you guys is your intellectual honesty, and I really appreciate that, and I know our listeners do as well. So yeah, but I don't know. Anything else, Elie?
I just want to not about the free will, but while Aaron's talking about what we do on our podcast, I just want to mention that the conversations we've been having here today, some of them might have been a little complicated or high level in terms of the physics. It's kind of hard to talk in an hour to give an overview of what we're talking about, and sometimes we're trying to give a bird's eye view, and we may have lost some of the listeners and some of the particulars. But I just want to emphasize that, I guess, my profession, I'm a professor, and I teach a community college, and I teach students who've never, ever understood math. And it's like what we try to do on our podcast is to simplify these arguments. So again, we develop the points step by step by step, and we try to explain everything, and we give analogies to help the listeners understand. And we're really trying to, I want to come off this like a high level. People are usually scared of physics and scared of math. I know all of my students are afraid of math. And we assume that our podcast listeners are afraid of physics. And that's kind of, we made the podcast in a way that we're attempting to reach a person who's interested in the topic of God and physics, understanding whether science indicates God exists, doesn't exist. And we're breaking down our arguments slowly, step by step, with analogies. We've made a YouTube videos with animations. We're trying to reach people and to break it down in a way that will be accessible. Our podcasts are about a half hour.
What are they called, Elie?
So far, we have 6 episodes released. And again, it's called Physics to God. Physics to God, and you can find it wherever you get podcasts.
No. I don't think there's. We have a
again, the point is, again, I don't want to scare anyone
listenership.
That's my main point.
They're so smart they could tell I just made that word up. But by the way, I want to just give you a suggestion. Elie, I don't know if you know, but every time you've been speaking, there's a light. There's just a light coming from above you, and that's definitely making. No. It's just a light.
Oh yeah, that's the light.
And it's a halo. And I've been taking what Aaron has to say just as seriously, even though there's no light above Aaron's. There's a thing hanging on the ceiling. It doesn't produce light. So I'm just saying you should keep that on the Physics to God podcast. Maybe you can put that on. give you both lights. Anyway, I really appreciate your time. This was amazing. And I'm a huge fan of what you're trying to do, because you're right. People are scared of math and physics, company included. These are not my areas. I've always been a humanities, social sciences kind of person. But as I've gotten older, I've become more, interested and excited. I've been doing a lot of reading on this stuff, and I just think it's so important. And the work that I do, I don't know if you guys know how much about MGE. If you don't, you should be ashamed of yourselves, because we are the cat's meow. But we reach out to 20s and 30s who are not necessarily raised with a lot of Torah knowledge or wisdom. So, but are smart, well-educated, successful young professionals who are out there in the world. And I have a lot of students who are scientists and are physicians and doctors and mathematicians, and a lot of computer science people today. And people have these questions, and people want to know what Judaism has to say. And, this age-old, it's like a primitive idea that religion has to be over here on one side and God and science on the other side, and the two are not. It's nonsense. I've been recommending Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory. He wrote a great book called The Great Partnership. I don't know if you guys have read it. Really worthwhile read. And it's about how science and religion are necessary for each other and how they're supposed to work together. And he drills down into Torah, into Judaism, how Torah was really meant to be studied alongside science and taught as one sort of wholesome, body of knowledge. And you guys are doing that. So I give you my yarmulkes off to you guys, and I wish you a lot of mazel and bracha in your podcasts. Everybody who's listening, it's called From Physics to God, and by Aaron Zimmer and Elie Fader. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.